Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le boonga, boonga. Bangkok ou Bogota, Le Caire ou Jakarta, Gustavia, on fait le boonga, boonga.
Hello, welcome to Sexy Pictures of Taylor Swift. No, I got you. We're talking about Brexit. This is Bunga Cast, the global politics podcast. At the end of history, I'm Alex O'Huley in São Paulo, Brazil. And this podcast is also Philip Cunliffe and George Hoare, our resident Brexiteers in the UK. Job done, boys. Job done.
Yeah, thanks.
Maybe we should leave that as an open part of the discussion.
Well, indeed. So we're mainly here to discuss a book that came out a year ago, I believe. It's a long time already. Is that right? It came out this year, right?
It came out in May.
Yeah,
of this year.
My notes, exactly. So it's a recent book called Taking Control, Sovereignty and Democracy After Brexit. It's by Lee Jones, Peter Ramsey, and also Philip Cunliffe and George Hoare, who are here to discuss it with. So I'm kind of enjoying this, having these guys as guests rather than as kind of fellow panelists or whatever we are, hosts. I think you call it that. So this is my opportunity to give them a grilling, give them a hard time, but also say how wonderful the book is and how listeners should go out and buy it like straight away. We're doing this on video. If you're listening on audio and you haven't realized, we're now doing video. This is our big pivot to video. So if you want to see our faces, which apparently are younger or older than you might expect, conflicting accounts here, please don't message us to tell us what you think about that. But do get in touch to tell us what you think about Brexit and about this episode. We'll be interested to hear more about that. Let's get cracking. We're recording this just for clarity's sake, on the 23rd of November. So I think over the weekend, there were elections in the Netherlands. And wow, surprise, surprise, another far-right populist has been elected in a European country. In this case, it was Geert Wilders' PVV coming in first. We don't know whether he'll be able to form a government. Maybe by the time you're listening to this, he has formed a government, or he's gone into opposition because other parties haven't allied with him. But this comes shortly after, just to kind of set this in context. Also, Javier Milei winning in Argentina. It all feels a little bit like a script that we're used to now. The big populist breakthrough and insurrection. It's a bit like, oh yeah, well, we know how this goes.
Yeah, I mean, to the point also because one of the main things that Geert Wilders is known for is a referendum on Dutch exit from the European Union. And apparently he's already, that kind of promise he accepts would be very difficult. There is no kind of real popular momentum for it. The vote for him and his party is mainly on the basis of opposition to mass migration and cultural conservatism. And so with respect to that, then, he's already kind of backing off, not only from some of his promises on, social policy and migration, but also most explicitly from a commitment to holding a referendum on withdrawal from the European Union. And it's a pattern that's repeated. The same kind of has happened that these major kind of national populist figures, Marine Le Pen, also Giorgia Meloni in Italy. Yeah. There's been examples where their Euroscepticism is only in opposition, and the closer they come to power or the closer they attempt to grab for power, they pull back from any promises that might destabilize the European Union or threaten to withdraw from it. So like you say, it's part of the script in Europe, Alex, and one that kind of underscores the exceptional character of Brexit.
George? Yeah, exactly. No, I think that's it, right? You have the kind of campaign as populist rulers, more straightforward conservative playbook. As somebody who used to live in the Netherlands, I don't know what I can tell you about the eternal soul of the Dutch people, if such a thing does exist, and why this might have happened or not. I think I'm too out of touch with with my time in the Netherlands. But yeah, I think it was is also part of the discourse. It's like, this is a shock. Look at take the most kind of outrageous things that Geert Wilders has said, and like look at try and, I guess, scare and discipline the voters of other countries into more sensible centrist options. Although, as as we just said, it's not it's not like all of the most radical bits of rhetoric are going to be kind of realised, and particularly around a Dutch exit, Dexit,
I mean,
or Holexit,
Nexit, I think. Anyway,
Ned
so
exit.
Yeah, it's Nexit. Dexit is German exit. I
Well,
think it's Nexit, Netherlands exit.
It can be Dutch and Hollandish and Netherlandish.
Well, I mean, if Holland separated from the Netherlands, that would be a shock. But I think Phil's right. It underscores, in some ways how exceptional Brexit was in terms of actually happening, because, there's been other cases where there's a Eurosceptic party comes in and kind of there's not even actually any genuine serious moves towards exiting the European Union, let alone a successful campaign and process to do that. And we're going to kind of recap a little bit of that process in a second. But another thing that what I thought was interesting in the news today is that immigration numbers in the UK. So Brexit was supposedly, certainly this was the reporting, certainly outside of Britain and to a certain extent in the liberal press in Britain, that it was an anti-immigrant backlash from the white majority. I mean, I've encountered this idea in Brazil quite often. If people mention Brexit, they're like, oh yeah, that's because they were against immigration, right? And I tried to tell them that that's not the whole story, or maybe not even the main story. Anyway, Brexit has been achieved now, and part of the reason that some people wanted Brexit was to limit immigration. That I don't think there's any question over. But net migration in Britain has now surged from around 100,000 at the start of the new Labour era in 1997, up to 300,000 when the Conservatives took over, which was in 2010, and it's now up to 700,000. That's despite Brexit and despite repeated Tory party promises to get those inward migration numbers down. Or actually, these are net migration numbers, but in any case. So was it all for naught? Did Brexit, I mean, I don't want to get into the big questions just yet about Brexit and what the consequences of it have been. But I mean, it's kind of remarkable, right? That gone through all this process. It was to kind of, in part, control borders, and nothing yet seems to happen. So maybe it's not the fault of the EU, Whose fault is it?
Well, yeah, that's the important question, I guess. Ultimately, it's it's our fault. We didn't take control. I mean, it's difficult to talk about this without going into some of the central arguments of the book, but this idea of take back control, one of the ways that was framed was around migration, and clearly we do not, that's not something which is controlled through democratic processes at the moment. You would say the Tory party are a very, very pro-immigration party. Let's see what happens in the upcoming general election, but it doesn't look like Labour are going to be particularly different on that score. So yeah, we have a very liberal migration policy, which some people might like, some people might not like, but it doesn't seem that that the concerns, the legitimate concerns or whatever, were listened to coming out of Brexit, because the numbers have gone up and up, and 1.2 million people. That's a lot last year, between I think it's July and July, like up until July 23. That's a lot of people. So
it's the size of the core city of Birmingham, which is Britain's second city after London. So I mean, it's an enormous kind of influx, and obviously makes the decaying infrastructure of the British state and public services all the more, strains all of that, all the more so.
I mean, this looks like a rosy picture for you guys, right? You basically have got Brexit, and you've got a sovereign state implementing still a liberal immigration policy rather than trying to close the borders. So that seems pretty good. You got what you wanted, right?
Let me roll back. So in answer to your question, Alex, about in the first instance, with respect to in the aftermath of the vote in 2016 on the referendum on withdrawing from the European Union, There was the so-called Lord Ashcroft poll, one of the major polling companies, and it's taken as one of the most definitive and important polls in terms of why people voted for Brexit. And the top answer was sovereignty. So people wanted an idea of national control that they felt had been confiscated from them by membership in the European Union. And the second answer, uppermost answer, was immigration, which is to say control over borders. And so the two things were an integral part of the idea of Brexit. And obviously at that point, the big question over migration was movement within the European Union, so-called free movement. And so, there you were talking about a different kind of migration to the most recent numbers. So that was migration from primarily Eastern Europe, and had been happening over the course of the previous decade or so. But it was Romanian migrants, Polish migrants, Bulgarian migrants. And now the same thing has been occurring, but with people from a different part of the world. And under the Tory governments that have won since the Brexit vote, they've kind of very explicitly set about making it easier to bring migrants from outside of Europe into the European Union. So it shows that the political economy of Britain, and this is something we talk about in the book, is very much configured around importing cheap labor, rather than, say, investing in capital, investing in technology, or investing in productive growth through capital investment and business investment, what have you. So instead, it's the only way the national economy can effectively grow is by importing cheap labor. That's the model. And there is no political party, either under Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, or under different Tory leaders, has found a way to change that. And so the difference between then and now is that is no longer clouded by membership of the European Union, but now is very clearly exposed as a political choice made by a Tory government that is incapable or unwilling to adapt a political economy in line with the wishes of the majority, because repeat polls show clear majorities are opposed to the level of mass migration we see at the moment, and that is possible. So the difference is that we have the possibility for greater political accountability, which we didn't have while we're members of the European Union.
All right, so let's not
committed.
This is getting into the argument of the book, so let's
Okay.
not do that just yet.
You asked the question. You
Yeah.
can't.
Oh yeah, but I'm
you can't
hosting this.
evade-
I'm also
You can't
deciding
evade the answer. just like no longer Britain's elites can evade political accountability for immigration.
Yeah.
There you go.
So I'm going to try to. There's going to be some. If you're a regular listener, you'll be aware of the kind of discussions that we've had about Brexit on this podcast. Often not in a dedicated fashion like its own episode, but it's cropped up very often because, well, it was an ongoing process through the early kind of first 3 years of this podcast or so, and obviously it was a concern of George and Phil's there. I followed it with interest, and also it was just an important. Kind of global conflict, I guess, or conflict of global weight.
It was your spiritual home as well.
Well, I don't know if my spirit's there. I have no soul. Anyway, I wanted to ask you guys. Thinking back to the week after the Brexit referendum, let's say a week or month or something like that. I'm not going to ask you how you reacted, but how did you imagine it going? What did you foresee happening when in June of 2016? Britain voted to leave. Like, what did you?
Yeah. So, I mean, I can take you back to the day after. I can paint a picture with words if you want. So, yeah, basically, I couldn't sleep. I didn't think that anything actually would happen. I thought that Remain would win fairly comfortably. I mean, that, as the book explains, there are reasons why someone like me, that kind of PMC type, might think this, and it was, of course, wrong. So yeah, I got up very, very early and went into work, and basically nobody wanted to sit near me because they all knew that I'd voted leave, and it was, I think, the only one in the office who'd openly done this. So people were kind of filling in. I was in one corner, just from the opposite corner, basically.
Smelly corner.
Well, I mean, I'm assuming it was due to having voted leave, but it could have been due to any number of personal failings, either kind of personality or hygiene. I guess that is true. Yeah. So what I mean, I was just quite shocked. I mean, it was a very surprising result. I hadn't seen it coming. So I was really not sure what was going to happen next, and I think this is the case for a lot of Britain's political class as well. They were, I mean, but it's kind of their job to have an idea of what might come next, and they really didn't plan for this. They didn't consider this possibility, to the extent that we had a number of years of just continual extended crisis where it was obvious that there was no force in British politics able to really grasp the nettle of Brexit. And we can talk about how that ended up resolving itself, but I think the feelings that I had in the immediate aftermath kind of deepened. I wasn't in shock anymore like several months later, but it was like, wow, there really is nobody in control of British politics, and that became clearer and clearer in a whole range of different ways.
Yeah, I mean, so it was the only, let me think. So the Brexit referendum was one of the very few national British votes that I participated in during my adult life. Well, in my life, because obviously I didn't participate before then. And it was a shock to me as well. So even though I voted, obviously, to leave the European Union, it was a shock to me because even though I thought it would be close, all the polls suggested it would be close. And even that Leave was ahead now and again, Leave seemed to be ahead. But I didn't think it would win on the day because I assumed that when people went into the privacy of the voting booth, that conservatism and risk aversion would prevail. And that however disenchanted and alienated people were with the status quo, they would they would kind of opt for the devil you know, for the devil you don't. That would be kind of that instinctive conservatism would prevail on the day of the vote itself. So I assumed that we would wake to a close vote, but essentially, the ship of state, such as we understood it to be at the time, would, kind of sail on in placid seas, as it were. The only inkling that something might have been amiss was I didn't stay up all night. I slept, in fact, because I was so confident that we wouldn't leave the European Union. But I did stay up late to watch the first constituency come in, which is Newcastle. And Newcastle is in the northeast, and it's one of the areas that is perhaps, you could say, despite kind of recent urban metropolitan renewal, it is one of the areas that has kind of proverbially suffered under neoliberalism and deindustrialization, the northeast of the country. And so people, the first declared the central kind of the Newcastle upon Tyne, the center, the core of that area, of that district, declared in favor of Remain. But the commentators during the night, this was around midnight or 1 a.m., if I recall correctly, they noted that it was a much tighter race than anybody expected, and that Leave did much better in the Newcastle constituency than anybody expected. So I thought, maybe this is going to be interesting, but not interesting enough to keep me up all night. So when I got up, and I looked and I, went onto Twitter and went onto the BBC News website and the rest of it, it was amazing. Like fireworks in the daytime, just stunning, like an unbelievable.
My question actually pertained more to how you foresaw the process happening, not what your emotions were.
I mean, that was the question. But think of our book, The End of History. Like one way to date this kind of the end of history to the end of history is precisely between the 23rd and 24th of June, 2016 in the UK. So it's like you have to allow us some license. I mean, the fireworks during the day, this is, you have to allow us this. I mean, but I think I did partly answer your question as well, Alex, that it was just so unclear. There was like straight away, there was, people resigning, backstabbing, even in, within months, there was clearly no, the Conservative Party was split and needed some time to reconstitute itself. It was mayhem. It was like very, because imagine, all through like New Labour and then coalition, it'd been a kind of there'd been incompetence and there'd been kind of, not particularly impressive politicians. But here you saw a situation where the political class as a whole was kind of wrong-footed, and so it proved to be, I would say.
So maybe to fill in the picture a bit, Alex, more along the lines perhaps than that you were thinking of, and maybe for the benefit of our listeners as well who are outside the UK. so I don't know, like so much of British politics prior to 2016 had been personalized. So for years, like British politics was this dominated by this completely tedious, personality clash essentially between Gordon Brown and Tony Blair. And there was this was the centerpiece of debate, and then subsequently during the coalition government of David Cameron and Nick Clegg, the Liberal Democratic deputy PM, after Gordon Brown lost that election, there was again kind of this question of personality politics, and it was incredibly kind of meaningless and tedious. And after the Brexit vote, there was again kind of major personalities when Michael Gove, one of the leading figures in the pro-Brexit campaign on the Tory side, defected. He broke ranks with Boris Johnson and thereby sabotaged Boris Johnson's bid for leadership. And it was this break in the ranks between Michael Gove and Boris Johnson that allowed the previously Remain supporting Home Secretary Theresa May to become Prime Minister, so that effectively a Remainer became leader of the Tory party and subsequently Prime Minister after David Cameron's resignation, quite against the expectation of Boris Johnson taking over. And this was like, this was, you picked up the front of the news and you wanted to know who had resigned, why had Michael Gove resigned, how is this going to split the Tory camp. It was suddenly it mattered. In a way before that, it didn't. These kinds of petty clashes, it suddenly mattered for the politics of the nation. It mattered. The intra-party feud suddenly mattered. All of it mattered because there had been this dramatic rupture, and suddenly it was all up for grabs. And this was all underscored by the also by the polling figures as they came in, that you had over 1.5 million people voted in the in that referendum than had voted in the previous election, even though they'd been eligible to vote. So it was clear that there was much greater kind of focus and intensity on the vote than there was in any ordinary general election. And this was also obvious in the run-up, right? Like I heard people talking politics on trains. Cabbies would ask me my opinion about the referendum, which had never happened to me in my life. Nobody, whenever they
normally
heard,
it's people asking cabbies their opinion, and it's just foreign journalists, and they're like, "Oh God, I'm being asked my opinion."
Yeah, exactly. Or if you told anybody you're a political scientist or an academic in politics, that would be enough to kill a conversation dead.
Yeah,
and I
mean, it is again now very often. I would say.
Once again, it is right. But in the run up to the vote, everyone was talking politics in a way that was extraordinary, and I've never seen it in my life and never seen it since. And so that was clear. It was very clear. You didn't need to consult any kind. You don't need to be a psephologist, right, to understand that there was some kind of meaningful ferment happening throughout the country at large. And so it was no surprise that the number of people who voted was significantly more in the referendum than in the prior elections or in the subsequent general elections either.
So one thing that I want to ask you to give a bit of a potted history briefly. We don't want to spend too long on it, but on the process of Brexit up until the UK actually leaves, or Britain leaves the EU. Come on to the question of the UK specifically, maybe towards the end. But and if you're a foreign listener and you're not exactly sure what the difference is between those, that'll also be explained, or why that matters. But so one of the things you do in the book, obviously, is I guess it's an attempt to set the historical record straight in terms of not just what happened, because there's other places probably who are doing that as well, but less interesting than in this book, but also set the record straight in terms of what the pivotal moments were and what the stakes were and the political import of those pivotal moments. I mean, I have the book here. Maybe I should describe it also, the cover, because it's kind of neat. Let me see, at least for video people, if you can see that. I think it's the Angel of the North. That's the inspiration, the Angel of the North by Anthony Gormley, the sculptor. But it's all the people of the country are contained within this angel, which I guess represents the nation, and it towers over this sort of not a utopian landscape. It's kind of like low key utopian. It's green hills, rolling hills, fat high-speed rail. Still waiting on that to be delivered, it seems. British people, but high-speed rail, some solar panels, but still cows and sheep, and like some geodesic dome in the city. So
What are
kind
you, a
of.
vegetarian?
Well,
It's
I
no,
thought you
no,
Brazilians loved cows, no?
no. Yeah, I love cows, dead or alive,
There you
especially
go.
dead, I guess. Anyway, so that's the cover of the book. But I like the idea that it conveys. Anyway, if whichever of you two wants to kind of give a
Well,
maybe
just on
maybe
the
choose
cover.
yeah.
Sorry, just on the cover. It's obviously supposed to be like Hobbes's Leviathan as well. Like
Yes.
this is all of us constituting national sovereignty. This is the power that we have collectively. I know that's a bit of an obvious point, but one that I think is important to. Yeah, so Michael Lightfoot, the artist who did this, was part of a group called Artists for Brexit. So we did draw on the. There were a few, not that many, artists who were for Brexit. So yeah, just wanted to fill in the obvious point about the cover there.
No, good. So and
And it
maybe
was
if
our
you,
angels. It was the angels of the north that won the vote, right? Because it was old working class, solidly Labour constituencies that would later become known as the Red Wall during the 2019 election. But it was Midlands and Northern English voters primarily, as well as districts in Wales, that won the vote for Brexit. So the Angel of the North is this sculpture, like Alex says, which is in the north, and so we figured it was an excellent image that would synthesize the actual outcome of the Brexit vote with the renowned kind of frontispiece of from Hobbes's Leviathan, the crucial, the leading, the great kind of English political theorist of the modern age, and that synthesizes the point about collective representation. Though unlike Hobbes's Leviathan, the people that constitute the democratic Leviathan in our case are all looking outwards rather than inwards. And underneath, I mean, I think it's fairly utopian. You got an airship, you got a rocket ship in the background as well as the geodesic domes and the high speed trains, and the green, the green and pleasant. What is it? England's green and pleasant land as well.
yeah, it
Yeah,
looks
it's
ecologically sustainable too.
Anglo-futurism. There's
Yeah.
no dark satanic
Okay.
melts.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, anyway, so that's enough about the cover, on which we should not judge the content of the book, I'm informed. So as to the contents of the book, maybe give us 3, I don't know, pivotal moments in the process of Brexit, which kind of illustrate how the process was going, whether you want to talk about the Chequers deal or the proroguing of Parliament or whatever. I don't know, up to you.
Yeah, I think it's often devolved into like, here is this specific deal, or here is this like this parliamentary event. I mean, but we don't try and give a kind of there is a timeline in the book of all the important events, but I think what we wanted to do much more than that was to try and synthesize everything that happened into a story which tells an important point, and that point is Brexit showed the exhaustion of all British political traditions: socialism, conservatism, liberalism, populism, each in their own way, showed themselves not to be able to fundamentally deal with the I would say that the most important event, which was the vote itself. We give a whole chapter to the vote, particularly to correct some of the slanders against the Brexit voters, and this is informed by some of the kind of empirical analysis, like what, as Phil said, Ashcroft poll, why do people vote, for leave? Because if you remember at this point in time, and I would say if you want to say this is like, to answer your question, what are the key moments? The first one, I think, would be that period of reaction. Like, and it was reaction. It was reactionary in the purest sense. There was a democratic moment without a democratic movement when people voted leave, and the political, cultural, intellectual elites of the country repudiated the voters. They were like, you idiots, like, you gammons, you morons, like low information voters, like idiot mouth breathing rubes. You've made the wrong decision. And so I think that was the first important moment of Brexit, is that it revealed the anti-democratic impulses of the elites and the left, and those two things not being the same. And yeah, it was just very, very revealing. I think the second, I don't, yeah, I can go through my my take on this. This is another
Yeah,
thing.
go
Like
for
having
it.
having four authors, it means you have slightly different emphases. The second moment was the political crisis that it generated. So we go through this obviously in a lot more detail in the book. How it was that that kind of initial reaction morphed into a clear divide between the people and the parliamentarians, if you want to say, the people and the representatives, if you want to put it this way. And there was all sorts of shenanigans and arguments and kind of political divides within the Conservative Party, within Labour. But what clearly happened, I would say, was there was no easy way to resolve this, because the representatives and the people were not on the same page. There was a vote in 2017 which was not decisive, and then there was a vote in 2019 that was. And I think this is the third kind of important moment, if after the reaction and then the crisis, is you had the beginning of the resolution. So there was finally a kind of a decisive vote which ended in a big Conservative majority. And this was the beginning of getting Brexit done. But even getting Brexit done, this was not, as we say, as we go into much more detail in the book, this was not the full Brexit, if you want to put it this way, not a fully democratic kind of sovereigntist Brexit. Instead, it was an attempt, ultimately successful, by a seeming populist within the Conservative Party, Boris Johnson, to basically put Brexit voters back in their box, hopefully permanently, but hopefully, well, from their point of view, but hopefully not from ours. So yeah, I mean, this is all at quite a general level, because I think what is often the story of Brexit is told in a very dry way. Like, here is this trade deal and this didn't happen. There was this vote and you have to remember all these dates. And no, it's more of you can do it much more schematically, because I think it teaches us a lot of lessons about some important political concepts which had seemed fairly dead, fairly kind of dry and dusty beforehand, which actually political events breathe some new life into. I don't know if you'd have the same take on this, Phil. We should have established the party line prior to coming on the show together, but hopefully you will not fundamentally disagree with the political analysis, even if you have some different emphases.
So I'd add a couple of things to the story. So, like George says, there's a timeline of events on pages 86 to 87 in the book, which I hope kind of anyone who reads it finds useful and will benefit from. And looking back, I mean, it was, like I mentioned before, like suddenly things mattered politically, and the atmosphere, and this is the atmosphere was intense, in some moments incredible, and the scenes from Parliament were astonishing. When, say, at certain points in 2019, when the whip was withdrawn from certain members of the Tory party, they were expelled from the Tory party for their failure to support the Brexit agreement under Boris Johnson. I mean, they were astonishing, and there's no kind of Parliament, in terms of Parliament, at least in terms of the internal crisis of the British political class, of the democratic structure of the British state. There's nothing comparable except, maybe the Home Rule crisis at the start of the 20th century, which at the time, people thought was leading to civil war over Ireland. And though the atmosphere, we weren't on the brink of civil war over Brexit, certainly the atmosphere, as we talk about in the book, was that of a cold civil war. So it was up to the point of the 2019 election that Boris Johnson won, the atmosphere was becoming just incredibly tense, and polarized, and seemingly, with kind of solidifying implacable hostility. So in terms of the key points, there'll be just one or two that I would add to the story to give, I suppose, a bit more shape to the answer that you're looking for, Alex. So one of the key moments throughout this was, and I think I flag them up because I think they're an important part of the story. So very quickly after Theresa May became Prime Minister, the former Home Secretary under David Cameron, she had supported Remain, which made sense, right? Because she was kind of a leading securocrat within one of the most dysfunctional arms of the British state, the Home Office, and one that was very closely integrated, particularly through its security functions, was very closely integrated in cooperating with police forces in Europe. So, as a bureaucracy and as a kind of overseer of that bureaucracy, she was an archetypal kind of Remainer who is fixed to the integration of the British state into the European Union over its security functions, cooperating with police forces and other bureaucracies in Europe. So, she became prime minister in July of 2016, swiftly after the vote that June. And she very quickly moved the following year. She very quickly, well, that year, she moved to put forward Article 50, which was the formal article for withdrawal from the European Union in the treaty associated with the European Union. And so she put forward the article for withdrawal 50, and this was important because it was an indication of the lack of support in the country for her, and also for politicians in general. Jeremy Corbyn, for instance, called on the 24th of June for Article 50 to be invoked, putting the Tory government under pressure. So there was consensus that the vote had to be respected. But rather than, say, taking their time with drawing up a strategy for how to withdraw from the European Union on Britain's terms, because there was such little support for the governing parties in the country, and they felt they lacked political confidence, she had to commit to invoke Article 50 as swiftly as possible, because it was the symbol that Britain was going to withdraw from the European Union. So her word, she gave this famous kind of remark to the press where she said Brexit means Brexit. It wasn't sufficient for the electorate. So they had to move extraordinarily quickly to invoke Article 50 and to mount the go through the legal processes of withdrawing from the European Union, because it was trying to placate an electorate that had dealt this kind of astonishing blow to the British political system.
I mean, it seems to me like hearing that what motivated, the certain kind of irony there, that what motivated the vote was in part the lack of credibility of the political elite, people's lack of belief in them as leaders, because they suck and they're useless, to put it basically. But that also means that when it came time to actually taking the country out of the EU, they suck and they're useless. And so that creates a problem because they don't have the trust of the electorate to actually see through their aims.
But like I said at the beginning, I mean, that's the accountability that was offered by Brexit, because one of the key features of the European Union was that it was there to absorb criticism of the political system. And it was the way in which it set the outer parameters for what was politically possible or desirable. Everything was organized and arranged with partners in Europe, but that also offered the possibility to scapegoat political decision-making as well. And so political decision-making could always be deflected, or accountability for decisions could always be deflected by attributing blame to the constraints that were imposed by the European Union. And that was no longer available once the vote had been had to withdraw from the European Union. And so when you make this point, it's true. This was a criticism that was made frequently of the vote, or it was a backhanded affirmation of the vote. People would say, oh, well, something would go something like this. You'd say, well, I don't think the voters are stupid, but it was just a protest vote. It wasn't a real it wasn't a really meaningful vote to leave the European Union. People hadn't fully considered the implications of what it involved, and it was a protest vote against the political elite. And that was true, right? But it didn't diminish the significance of the vote, because I think what voters had intuited in the run-up to the referendum was that it was a qualitatively meaningful choice in a way that was different from prior elections. And they understood that because that was the way the referendum had been presented to them. There was a remarkably expensive propaganda campaign conducted by David Cameron's government. They spammed all houses up and down the country with a leaflet committing to withdrawing from the European Union, committing to enacting the decision if they, whatever the decision was, though the government encouraged, people to vote for Remain. But everyone lined up on one side with one or two exceptions, right? In terms of the major figures of the political elite, the overwhelming majority of the political establishment, bankers, industrialists, lovies, leading intellectuals, actors, celebrities, everyone lined up in one direction. And voters intuited that this was an extraordinary possibility to give the elite a bloody nose, but also they understood that it was a meaningful choice, and so it was more than a protest vote. Or another way to say the same thing, it was a very accurately targeted protest vote, because it wasn't a kind of a lashing out, but it was actually targeted at the core of the
the kind of the way that,
limitations on the British public life, which was the European Union. So
Yeah.
the European Union was, that is what determined and set the was the basis of legitimacy for the political elite, and also set the confines of what was permissible, desirable, and legitimate in British politics.
I mean,
And so it was a protest vote that was accurately aimed, and that was vindicated by the reaction to it in the aftermath of the referendum.
So I mean, it occurs to me also that especially for those following from afar, especially maybe in the US, because I think you're probably in another EU country, you would probably have caught wind of the process, but probably been reported on a little bit more in your domestic newspaper, whether you're in Germany or Sweden or wherever else. But for Americans maybe less so, and it probably was a little bit. It ends up being, I think, if you look at foreign reporting on it, it's a story of a government and the EU, right? So the domestic tensions aren't particularly brought to light. They're hard to, because it's like the personalities and like who's Theresa May, who's Gove, who's Johnson, etc. And it's all happening within one political party, right? Because the Tories, there was no change of government over this period. There was no national election which threw up the opposition coming into government to actually lead the Brexit process. It didn't split so neatly even between party lines, to the extent that there was kind of very soft levers within the Tories and hard levers.
For the benefit of our American listeners, right, Trump and Brexit, they both happened in the same year, 2016, and they're often kind of talked about in the same breath as these tremendous shocks to Western politics. But there is a significant difference in, like you say, Alex. I mean, well, in the first question, the Trump vote was entirely kind of anticipated, run-of-the-mill general election, in the sense that it just went ahead, or presidential election as it went ahead in the US. Whereas in the case of the referendum, it was a one-off kind of plebiscite that was understood by everybody involved to pertain to very basic constitutional questions in Britain, in the United Kingdom. So there was an immediate difference, and it also split votes in a very different way. Whereas in the first kind of election with Trump, it was essentially Republican voters mostly voted for the Republican candidate, Democratic voters mostly voted for the Democratic candidate, with the exception of the Rust Belt kind of swing vote that switched from Obama to Trump and gave him the electoral college votes that he needed to get over the line and win the presidency. Whereas in 2016, in Britain, it was a very different picture. You had, you had a complete flipping of what was expected, because you had old Labour constituencies coming out for Brexit, despite the Labour Party being hostile to Brexit. You had, as well as Tory shires that were kind of very comfortable and well off, coming out in support of Brexit as well, despite the majority of the Tory party being opposed to Brexit. So you had all sorts of upsets, even in Scotland, which the majority voted to remain in the EU. A solid 1/3 of Scottish voters voted to leave the European Union, and the figure was even higher among supporters of the Scottish National Party. Right? So the point is, like, it cut across established political divisions. It destabilized the political system within political parties as well as between political parties, in a way that was very different. And so it's important because it's an important difference with the other kind of populist eruptions of those years, even though it's often assimilated to them.
No, I think that's good also because for those who understood it as just being kind of like a right wing thing, right? And then like the left and liberals were for the EU, and that this was just like the right doing its thing, and then the right wins. And it's like, well, that's a kind of a truth insofar as it was something that came from the Tory party. But as you've said, there's divisions within the Tory party. There was divisions within the Labour Party, and insofar as the Labour Party stands for Labour voters as much as it does the party itself. So these divisions run through, and actually one of the interesting things rereading the narrative history part of the book, kind of retelling what happens, is the way that these shifts suddenly change these dynamics. So even though it's still the Tories in government, right, that doesn't change throughout this whole process. Suddenly Jeremy Corbyn swings behind a people's vote, right? People's vote being the call
so
for a
actually,
second referendum. And that changes the dynamic suddenly as well.
Yeah.
So I wanted to go back to the story.
Yeah.
I was talking about Article 50. So Article 50 was an important kind of moment in as much as it indicated the continuity of a British political elite that was dependent on external support structures in order to make any kind of commitment. Because they knew that any promise they made was empty, they needed to kind of cling to these symbolic tokens that were embedded in EU treaty systems, in this case, the article on withdrawing from the European Union, in order to be able to motivate any kind of public support and commitment. So the Article 50, the fact that they had to do it around Article 50 rather than, say, which would have been a better strategy, might have been, say, breaking up the European Union through bilateral negotiations with leading figures in the European Union. And there was a brief moment that the British state could have pursued this. Instead, by going for Article 50, they allowed the European Union to consolidate itself as a single coherent bloc in negotiations with Britain. Anyway, it's only this was an important moment. Another important moment was in 2017 when you had the election was called. Theresa May had to consolidate her power base as being the unexpected prime minister, and all the polls suggested the Tories were going to do very well as the party that was more clearly associated with Brexit, and instead Labour did remarkably well. And Jeremy Corbyn, as I'm sure many listeners will know, that was, Jeremy Corbyn did unexpectedly well. A tremendous kind of show of a tremendous boost for the Labour vote. He gained parliamentary seats unexpectedly. This was seen as a tremendous vindication again for the Labour Party programme, for another kind of indication of the arrival of populism, of left populism, and the rest of it. The following year, 2018, the second, and this was really, I think, an important turning point, was when the so-called People's Vote campaign was launched in April of 2018. This was kind of a yuppie populism, because it was the idea of taking us back into the European Union, but making it or effectively overturning the vote, and making it without having another referendum, but overturning the vote before we left the European Union. And this was very important because this was what really enhanced the intensity of the Brexit process, that there was now an organized, very well-funded, very well-organized, widely supported political movement in the UK that was dedicated to overturning a democratic decision before it had been enacted. And not only any democratic decision, but the one in which more people had voted in support of a very clear political choice than in all of British modern political history. So this turned out, then there was the back and forth over the following years. The following year in 2019, the EU endorsed the withdrawal agreement that had been negotiated by the Theresa May government, but then Britain was forced to withdraw it because she wasn't able to get it through Parliament. And then because Britain was still a member in 2019, this is 3 years, remember, after the Brexit vote at this point, despite the fact that Britain was still a member of the European Union, despite Britain had voted to leave the European Union, we were still members. And so in 2019, we participated in the European parliamentary elections of May that year. And there was a tremendous vote in support of the Brexit Party, which had been assembled by the former UK Independence Party leader Nigel Farage. And they did tremendously well in the European parliamentary elections. Importantly, they took a lot of support in the Midlands and the north of England, which again, traditional Labour constituencies. And this the European parliamentary vote in May 2019 made Theresa May's leadership of the Tory party untenable after that. So the Tories then were forced into a leadership, another leadership vote, and this led to Boris Johnson coming to power, backed by Dominic Cummings, who was one of the architects of the Brexit campaign on the Tory side, and he was the one who came up with the slogan "Take Back Control," that had been so effective in the run-up to the vote in 2016. And then the Tory party won their landslide vote in 2019, giving Boris Johnson a tremendous mandate. They won 80 seats. They decimated Labour support in its old industrial heartlands in the Midlands and the North. And it looked as if, in early 2020, it looked as if the Tories had cracked a new model for conservative rule in the 21st century, because they had reached out to old working class constituencies and found a way to appeal to them with promises of public investment, support, and most importantly, in respecting the vote.
So one thing that I wanted to ask about is that, a lot of this as I said already before, a lot of this looked like a conflict between Tory leaders and their delegates and the European Union, and they're confronting each other over trade deals and trying to negotiate this out. So it seems like a very intergovernmental affair, right? And maybe, if you're watching this from afar and you kind of go, well, there's all these European countries united against this Johnson guy who I don't like. I hope the Europeans beat him and kind of give him a bad deal or whatever. Or you might go alternatively, no, I like this Brexit idea. I hope they win and I hope they beat the Europeans. Right. But that obviously is not the whole story, because there's a whole it's not just a matter of the British national interest against the European one, but there's also the interest of Tory leaders and their vision of Brexit. And then there is the interests of the British masses, which are not consistent with those previous two things. Right. So you've got these three parts, let's say, and I don't know how you necessarily square them. Right. So the British masses might want to get a good deal out of the process and not be screwed by a bad deal or by no deal. You have the Tory leaders' vision of Brexit, where they just want to, certainly in terms of Boris Johnson, wanted to get the country out. And then you have the need in those negotiations to be strong against the EU. Whatever your vision might be, you kind of need Britain to win out in those negotiations, which would suggest you would need to back your leaders, the Tories, as much as possible to get the best deal out of it. But that means not questioning the Tories and what their vision is. So there's some moving parts there which aren't, don't fit together entirely. How do you negotiate that, and how do you see that?
I'm not sure I agree. Would be my short answer. So by the time we got to 2019, people had voted for Brexit in 2016, in a general election in 2017, in European elections, in a general election. Like, there was a clear mandate that the Tories had by the time Johnson got into power, that people had voted for this multiple times. I think.
But there's still what deal you get. How able are you to get a deal?
Yeah, I mean, earlier in the process, it did become clear that one of the things which gave the EU a much better bargaining position is that we weren't really prepared to leave without a deal. If you're not prepared to walk away from a negotiation, it's a very basic point. Yeah. If you're not prepared to walk away from a negotiation, then it puts you in a less good position. But yeah, I mean, what I would agree with was, I think, I guess one of the kind of more political assumptions of what you're saying, that nobody really wanted this. Like, as within the political class, what was the EU? It's not an external constraint. It is something which is part of the internal decomposition of representative politics in a member state, and it is something that the ruling class can use quite comfortably to evade responsibility. So it's quite, you're put in a difficult position as a politician if you're expected to lead Britain's departure from the EU, because you're basically putting yourself under more fire, potentially. You'll put it basically saying, well, I'm going to get rid of these kind of external constraints, and I'm now going to be more accountable for what my party decides to do. So yeah, I mean, there's not a straightforward kind of interest within one of the two kind of established parties in British politics, i.e. Labour or the Conservatives, to kind of put forward a really radical Brexit plan, and that's exactly what happened. There was, get Brexit done, which is how it eventually got resolved, is completely depoliticizing. It's like, get this away. We don't want this kind of potential kind of active ingredient in our politics. Instead, we would prefer to go back to the pre-2016 days, ideally even like the London Olympics of 2012, when everything was much easier and more straightforward for the political class, because everyone agreed on everything and it was all fine and good. So yeah, I mean, it's not in that way surprising that there wasn't there was some populist challenges of various different sorts, but there wasn't within the kind of established political parties of Britain, there wasn't a clear vision and program and for what Brexit could be.
I mean, I would add kind of one final part to my kind of chronological sketch. And this answers your question, Alex, about, I think there were fewer moving parts than you lay out, because the difference in early 2019, Jeremy Corbyn, who is at that point leader of the Labour Party, he endorsed a second referendum. And this is what notoriously led the Labour Party to such a crushing defeat. The number of seats they had in Parliament dropped to levels not seen since the 1930s. It was a tremendous blow, not least because they lost, kind of constituencies, their heartlands, constituencies that some of which had always been Labour since they were created. And the difference between the surge in the support for Labour in 2017 and the defeat for Labour in 2019 was precisely the commitment to the second referendum. And so this, I think, was the part of the most important part of it, because it indicated that all of the promises that Labour made in 2019 were seen as hollow without a commitment to respect the earlier vote. And that, I think, was the central mess. That was, again, voters understood this very, very basically, that it was shot to pieces. The switch to undoing the earlier vote in 2016, the fact that Labour now pivoted behind the idea of a second referendum, indicated that all of their promises were hollow, and that there was no coherent democratic basis on which to support the Labour Party, and they crashed and burned. And so it indicated, insofar as there was mass feeling and mass ferment, it was captured by Boris Johnson's Tory party. And so the promises of greater public investment, the promises of a more expansive and supportive state, the promises of renewed investment in constituencies that had been overlooked and left, kind of been run as a one-party state in the North and the Midlands by Labour and had not won anything from government for decades. All of that was going to be overturned by the promises now that were lavished on them by a Tory party that had also committed to respecting the 2016 referendum. So I think there was, the mass democratic feeling was certainly captured by the Tory party at that point. It is remarkable as well. The story of how they lost that and how they've squandered that majority in the intervening time is also a remarkable story in itself.
So I want to move on to some of the bigger questions now. I think one interesting thing you say in the book, or that you illustrate, is that given the difficulties of getting Brexit through, if you just wanted some of the benefits, right? Like you'd say, yeah, I'm in favor of Brexit because it'll give us more democracy and we can arrange different trade deals. We're not stuck by the EU. We can get rid of some of the regulations. We can, have more restricted immigration policies, whatever. And so that you're willing to settle for some sort of compromise deal with the thing. But the thing is, as the longer that goes on, the more difficult it seems, right? And that ultimately you come to realize, what's the point of Brexit, right? What's all, if it's going to be all that fuss, maybe we're just better off remaining in. And I think that's kind of the conclusion that people ends up being what you're naturally pushed towards, unless you have a vision of this much more thoroughgoing democratic vision of Brexit that you kind of want to push people towards. Basically, kind of saying, well, it kind of has to be this full Brexit vision, because as soon as you start rolling back on that great democratic promise and ripping Britain out of the EU, transforming it into, or rebuilding the British nation on a new basis rather than have it be as a member state. If you're not going to do that, then there's no kind of halfway house. It doesn't really work, because then you kind of get a situation where, for example, you're taking rules from the EU without being able to shape them by being in the customs union or something like that. So I think that's quite neat. But then that leaves so your basic point is there is no kind of possibility of Brexit without a kind of some transformative vision. Now, what is that transformative vision? Because ultimately, you've had Brexit. It's happened now. You've won. Why care about Brexit? This is one of the few populist moments of the past decade that's actually led to some institutionalized change. The only one that I can think of off the top of my head. And everything has gone back to the way it was. Probably worse, in fact, because not only have you got a kind of kind of two centrist figures leading the two main parties, there's also no populist energy to the left or to the right of them. No Corbyn, no Farage. Farage currently, I think, is away in the Australian jungle on a reality TV show, just to illustrate that point. Although maybe that's just a plank for his return to frontline politics. But nevertheless, the point is, well, was it all worth it? And I mean that seriously, because things kind of look worse in Britain now than they did before Brexit. And it seems to, for all that we talked it up, and I believed in it, this is going to really shake things up. This is going to be great. This is going to open up a new horizon of politics. Actually, no.
No, I'm not sure. I'm not sure I would kind of assent to some of the basic premises of what you're saying. I mean, as soon as the Brexit vote was made, there was, at that point, there's already, kind of transformative vision or notwithstanding, there's still a reason to defend Brexit, because you have to respect, well, you don't have to, but certainly as a Democrat, I would very much like if votes are respected. So the kind of, I think the situation changed from the 23rd to the 24th of June in 2016, because one was before there was a vote, so you can campaign for leave, but then it was a campaign for having that vote enacted. And I think second point would be putting any conditions on the kind of instrumental or the consequences of Brexit. This was essentially the Lexit position, or a position that we were often described as being kind of Lexiteers. And in a very, I think a very good piece that Phil wrote said, well, no, we're not Lexiteers. I mean, Brexit Bolshevik is a term that Phil used in that piece, which, I can't speak on behalf of all of the authors of the book, but I think is a neat term. And this is the basic idea that Brexit is good independently, good for democracy, independently of whether there's a left-wing party in government, whether there's kind of all of the things that could happen, that kind of initial Corbynite energy of like, we could do all these things outside of the EU, which did soon dissipate. Instead, no, Brexit is good because, points we've already made. And this is why the situation today is different.
But you can buy that. You can buy that and look around and kind of go, yeah, but Britain's not more democratic now than it was before.
Well, it is in one sense. Yes, it definitely is.
Because it's connected to what we were talking about at the start, right?
Somebody is now accountable for those immigration figures. If people don't like it, then politicians can't say anymore, oh, it's due to EU rules. Now it's like, this is our choice as the Tory party. If people don't like it, they can tell the Tories to get stuffed. And equally, if Labour have a very pro-immigration policy and people don't like that, until Labour get stuffed. I mean, we haven't suddenly entered kind of, communism, but there is a fundamental qualitative change, and that is important.
So around at the time of the expansion of the European Union eastwards and the absorption of new members, it's Mervyn King, and we know this now because the records have been declassified. Mervyn King, who was then governor of the Bank of England, which is an independent central bank, he told Tony Blair to let in, to commit to allowing free movement for migrants coming in for labour, cheap labour coming in from the new members of the eastern members of the European Union. And he said, this would be good, in his words, because it would act as a drag on wage growth, so that there would be fewer inflationary pressures in the economy. And the Bank of England is committed to inflation targeting, to keeping inflation under control. The way this was confidential, right? So this was confidential memos that have only since been revealed. The way this was justified was so Tony Blair justified this as, we have to do this because this is part of being a member of the European Union, even though other European Union states had put back the date by which they would agree to free movement to people from Eastern Europe. So new citizens of the European Union, whereas Britain was among the first in. And the numbers that arrived were far in excess of what the new Labour or the British state had planned for. But it completely transformed, radically transformed British society, but also perpetuated a British political economy based on importing cheap labour. So that was the way the European Union functioned, right? Membership of the European Union. The decision was made on internal British grounds about in the interests of the policy of the central bank, but it was justified by reference to membership of the European Union that tied our hands with respect to certain decisions, such as how people coming and going from within the European Union, that we had to absorb this wave of mass migration from Eastern Europe, because this was a necessary part of being part of the European Union. And so this was very much in keeping with the entire era of Blairite globalization, right? The idea that there was no alternative, that globalization was a force of nature. All you could do was adapt rather than mold or shape, or let alone kind of transform or change. Excuse me. So that option is no longer available, right? So the European Union was the institutional form that globalization took in British politics. It was the institutional form by which British politicians could instantiate neoliberalism. It was the institutional form. It was the political form of globalist neoliberalism. And that is no longer the case, right? You can no longer palm off decisions that are made by elected politicians and make it simply the case as if there's something which is imposed by diktat from the outside.
So let me put this
difference.
Let me put this a different way, because I could easily be the interviewer who's not convinced, and I want to believe, right? So I'm convinced, but I think a lot of people wouldn't necessarily be convinced, because they're still looking around and going, look, it's still the same politicians in charge. They're not going to listen to us, right? So, well, I think, let me put this differently, because reading through again, to refer to the kind of historical narrative in the book, what becomes clear is that throughout the whole process, there was not even a glimmer of a constituted force which could really see things through. They were all contradictory at best, and that's when they weren't actively anti-democratic. So, the Corbynistas were contradictory. Eventually, they kind of folded on the Brexit question. The Johnson types, saw through Brexit, but they weren't really interested in any kind of transformative moment, let alone kind of refounding a democratic republic. Well, certainly not a republic, but even a democratic monarchy, whatever that might be. Certainly not interested in that, let alone in kind of using the possibilities for increasing spending, state aid, etc., revolutionizing the economy, any of these things. So, I mean, what's amazing kind of following this process, yes, Britain kind of ends up, by hook or by crook, getting out of the European Union. But it's like there was no force really leading that. No force constituted itself to lead that. And so maybe, that's why you kind of end up in the situation where everything looks remarkably like it did before.
Yeah. I mean, I've got two, I don't know if they're sound bites or slogans, but yeah, I mean, I think it is a valid question, but I think it's important that we, in the book and around the time of having all these discussions, we thought that Brexit was necessary but not sufficient for a democratic transformation. Like, it's not like you achieve Brexit, bam, suddenly you have this transformation. And this is precisely because, and here's the second slogan, Brexit was a democratic moment without a democratic movement. There was no new model army to actually, carry things through. It was the form that a a kind of democratic moment is likely to take within a member state of the European Union. Or there are lots of similar sorts of states in across the world, but this is, it's very heavily constrained because there aren't these vehicles, there aren't these institutions to catalyze and organize people. So there's not, it's not sufficient for transformation, and I don't think many people, other than the most kind of deluded, perhaps kind of Thatcherite Eurosceptics, might have thought, we just get Brexit and suddenly we're global Britain. No, it requires democracy requires, or sovereignty, more accurately, is in Hobbes's view, for example, would be something about the quality of the relationship between the governed and the governors, and that doesn't fundamentally change overnight due to Brexit, but it cannot change but through processes like Brexit. So, I am sympathetic to this because I'm not particularly satisfied with the condition of British politics, but it's a step in the right direction.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, and I think Britain is further ahead in terms of the democratic renewal that's necessary, emerging from decades of neoliberalism and globalization, political and economic globalization. Britain is further ahead than I think probably any country in the world, and certainly states in the US, states in the West, right? So to that extent, if it's a slow process, that should come as no surprise, but also it means that I still, I'm confident that part of the wrenching political transformations that have been wrought in the last few years they'll significant, their repercussions and implications are significant. And you say there've been no changes, Alex, but there have, right? I mean, the Red Wall, the revolt of the Red Wall in 2019, where constituencies where they used to mock them, they said a donkey with a red rosette would be elected to Parliament if the Labour Party put it up in those places. And the people in those, former mining communities and constituencies, people in outlying towns and exurban, suburban areas of major metropoles in the North and Midlands, they showed they can't be taken for granted. It was a tremendous working class revolt against the political representatives of working class voters, and that was something to behold. And now they're swinging back. If the polls are to be believed, they're going to swing back to the Labour Party and away from the Tories. So
doesn't that rather undermine your point? I mean, that they'll
No,
either come back home or they won't vote.
This is an important.
they're not
point.
They're not one party states. They're swing states now, right? They used to be little one party statelets, constituencies that were under the thumb of the Labour Party, and they've demonstrated their political independence and that they can do as they please, right?
Political independence is an important, I think that's the important point that Phil's making, that it's, people are now no longer, allied to these old and failed and kind of decayed institutions. Anyway, sorry, Phil, I don't need to tell you what you're really saying, but
No, but it underscores the point. And another significant thing is, like I say, in 2019 and early 2020, it really did look like Boris Johnson. This is what the op-eds were saying. He had a vision for conservative parties everywhere.
Yeah.
Excuse me. Forgive listeners and viewers. I'm recovering from viral bronchitis, so I got a cough. But like in the early days, right, of the Johnson government, it looked like he had a model that was going to be rolled out across the West. Conservative parties saw how they were going to win back old working class constituencies and forge new electoral coalitions that would, lead them into the middle of the century to rule. Gone. Shot to pieces, right? So another kind of indication of the turbulence that still hasn't been contained or resolved as a result of Brexit. And that's without even mentioning the instability that Brexit has introduced into the structure of the British state itself, which is over the union. Right, because and just briefly, because this is a complicated history, and I'm sure we have some Irish listeners who will, be able to offer more detail in their comments and feedback and so on. But the difference between the deal that was offered to the EU by Theresa May and the deal that was offered by Johnson was where you draw the trade border, right? So Theresa May's because she lost so many votes to Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party, she became dependent on the support of Protestant unionist parties in Northern Ireland. And that meant that she, in her deal with the European Union, she had to ensure that there was nothing that would jeopardize the place of Northern Ireland in the United Kingdom. Because Northern Ireland, due to the peace agreement that ended the war in Ireland in the 1990s, the Good Friday Agreement, Northern Ireland is very heavily integrated into trading with the Republic of Ireland, and it's part of the peace agreement that they're integrated with the rest of the Republic of Ireland. So the point being, right, that she had to commit to not doing anything that would jeopardize the economic place of Northern Ireland in the Union. And this meant the possibility of diverging from the European Union in terms of any meaningful economic or regulatory and policy changes was shot, right? And this was due to her dependence on Northern Unionist votes. This changed with Boris Johnson's election in 2019. The fact that he took all those constituencies from Labour meant that he was no longer dependent on the vote of Northern Unionists in Northern Ireland.
Right.
And so this gave him greater political independence. And the deal that he gave the European Union drew a border. So the trade border was no longer between Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, and Northern Ireland, which is ruled from London, but was rather in the Irish Sea, which is to say between Britain and Northern Ireland. So the way Johnson resolved the dilemma was by weakening the union, right, in order to secure the deal with the European Union. He weakened the United Kingdom in order to secure the deal with the European Union. And so this has left a kind of a centrifugal force, which is slowly eroding the United Kingdom itself as a result of Brexit. And this is why people are talking about the prospect of Irish reunification as a result of Brexit, which also, as a knock-on implication and effect, calls into question the union of the other three remaining nations, Wales, England, and Scotland, within Britain, right? So the point is there's still tremendous political ferment as a result of Brexit, which is not resolved. Not just the kind of the status of the North and the Midlands, which I mentioned, but also the status of the Union itself, as well as the prospect of Irish reunification. And those are only some of the questions.
So, I mean, the thing I'm wondering also is, as I alluded to earlier, there was no force that was really willing to see through Brexit, right? Certainly with a vision for a transformative Brexit. It just didn't exist. There were parts of it separated in different parties, but no one was able to kind of unite those forces amongst the people together into different into a vision and provide leadership. And one of the things I wonder is that the transformative vision of Brexit, which is the only one that is worth anything, I think it's more or less your point, and it's one that I agree with, is that, and as you say, it's a process which goes beyond Brexit. The kind of democratic transformation needs to continue. But it ends up all being, in my view, a little bit arid. So even if you buy the constitutional and the kind of theoretical arguments about effectively taking back control, about, not making government subject to kind of intergovernmental treaties or to, backroom deals with their European partners, but be responsive to the people. Okay, sure. But isn't it lacking something a bit sexier? And you say in the book, sovereigntists, meaning, kind of yourselves and the people that you're trying to appeal to, sovereigntists do not need over-detailed plans for the future as long as they're clear about the stakes of sovereignty. Isn't that kind of evasive? You yourselves are letting yourselves off the hook, the democratic responsibility, because you're not painting a vision of the future. You're just going, no, we'll just have democracy and then we can choose. For a lot of people, it's like, yeah, maybe that worked in the 17th and 18th century because that was a sexy new idea, democracy, self-rule. But in the 21st century, democracy is everywhere. Everyone talks about democracy. It's not a sexy new idea. Democracy is a label stuck on so many different things, including some really ugly things. Maybe it doesn't even sound that sexy, right? Doesn't sound that appealing. So maybe did Brexit not need its own poetry? Did it not need a more rounded out vision?
It's a sexy old idea, though. like democracy.
Yeah,
It's
but
still
lots of
No,
people
it
didn't.
did. No,
It
but what I
is.
would say, no, but look, I did, right? But the difference was that it was attached to sovereignty, right? And that was what made it meaningful. In a way, the democracy had been completely hollowed out in its meaning. Um, and I think it's an important point, Alex, you make, because obviously, democracy had been, it's long been debased. Um, Throughout the Cold War era, I suppose, most significantly by the Eastern Bloc, the so called people's democracies of the Eastern Bloc. They debased democracy, and they made it easier for the liberal democracies of the West to claim that mantle for themselves, given how they, abused the title. But after the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the disappearance of the Warsaw Pact, um, the way democracy was debased was by being conjoined to a cosmopolitan, supranational vision of politics, right? So democracy was something that became associated with, kind of the expansion of liberal capitalism. Democracy became something that was associated with US hegemony. It became something associated with European integration. It became something associated with, lobbying, NGO lobbying in Brussels, something associated with transnational integration, following the diktats of kind of world trade deals, membership of the World Trade Organization, the expansion of free trade blocs, deregulation, and so on. And that was the way in which democracy had been debased in that neoliberal post-Cold War period. And that was because it was sundered from sovereignty. Right. So the difference was that Brexit was the process of reattaching democracy to sovereignty. So to the idea of a final authoritative center of power and decision making within the state that would make public decisions and public choices meaningful, politically meaningful. And that is what makes democracy matter, right? You need sovereignty to make democracy meaningful. And so that was what Brexit offered. And that is in answer to your question about whether democracy is just kind of an empty platitude in the contemporary era. It certainly had been in the, kind of when it's simply seen as as an appendage of globalization. But the prospect of attaching it to national sovereignty gave it its specific inflection in Brexit that changed that. And the vision, as far as our vision for Brexit goes, it's contained, I think, within the image that we already discussed on the front cover of the book. The program is fleshed out in the latter part of the book, but as far as it has its own poetry and its own image, it's contained within that. And we also should give some credit to Dominic Cummings, who is one of the leaders of the Vote Leave campaign in 2016, because he was the one who came up with the slogan "Taking Back Control." Clearly resonated so much with so many voters because it spoke to their sense of political disaffection and alienation. And he offered the idea, he showed that politics could matter, that people did want actually more control over their public lives and over their lives through their involvement in politics. He proved that by winning the referendum on that slogan. And we take it further because we indicate it wasn't possible to take back control because there was no, kind of British nation, which was ready to emerge kind of resurgent from the rubble of member statehood. That British nation has to be created. And that is what we propose to do through our program, which is detailed
So on those,
towards the end of the book.
on those proposals, I mean, you don't talk about things like building out high-speed rail or nationalizing industries or raising taxes or shutting borders. There's none of that. And I mean, indeed, you were critical of the Lexit idea, which made leaving the European Union conditional on getting certain democratic goodies and the Labour Party being in power. And I understand being, critical of that, absolutely. I still think, and this is a question of political practice, not a question about the history or theory of Brexit of the past couple of years, that maybe a little bit more concreteness in the vision of what a Brexit Britain would look like maybe wouldn't have hurt. Maybe because once that enthusiasm for taking back control wanes, as it seems to have done, it's left then kind of wanting, what next? How does my life improve? Right. And answering those questions. Now you have some proposals, not necessarily how does my life improve kind of proposals, but you talk about exiting NATO, about letting Northern Ireland go, effectively, undoing devolution to Scotland and Wales, and then a series of political reform initiatives like ending corporate finance for political parties, including the trade unions attachment to the Labour Party, which is would be controversial on the left, even if the ending corporate donations to political parties would otherwise be a popular thing on the left. Introducing proportional representation and a couple other beside. Do you want to talk us through
Alex,
those?
you're still defending Corbyn years after he was smashed to pieces
Not at all.
by a complete buffoon, right? Boris Johnson.
No,
You
I
are.
think he screwed it. I think he
Because the
screwed it. I was always
implication-
critical. What was I
No, but
critical
the
of?
implication of what you're saying is, like the only thing that matters are material goods
Oh,
and
I didn't
political
say that.
representation. Yeah, but that's the implication of what you're saying. Political voice don't matter, right? And
No,
what we're
political
saying
voice does
is,
matter, but you need to win. The point is not, hey,
yeah, but the voters,
you're going to get
if
some
they-
more
the
welfare
voters
spending. That's not what I'm
themselves- yeah, but
saying.
look, this isn't us saying this, right? This is what the voters themselves said in 2019. They wanted voice, right? And so, and this is the point that we argued about and we made before on the podcast. The Labour Party promised everything in 2019. They were even joking. They were practically joking with broadband communism as a slogan.
Yeah,
right?
that was
The
just
idea
one
they were
minor
going
part of
to-
one minor part of the thing.
It was not minor. The point is they gave all sorts of fantastic promises
And then they
about
and they
investment,
did, and they took away voice. Exactly, but you need
public
both.
infrastructure,
That's
and
what I'm
they were
saying. You
shot
need
to
both.
pieces.
But the point is
No,
that
but
you
the
need
point
both.
is that voters plumped when they were given a choice between goodies, right, being showered on them from on high, and voice. They chose voice.
Let me just be clear, because of this slander. I wrote something at that time saying, because of the lack of trust in politics, promising voters things, if people don't like you and don't trust you and feel they have no control over government, is not going to get you anything, and that's why Labour lost. So I made that
I'm
point
not
very explicitly at the
slandering
time.
you. I'm not slandering you, but I'm saying what you're saying is inconsistent.
You're
right?
misrepresenting. You're misrepresenting me, because I have made this point very clearly. What I'm
I know
saying
you have, and I think
is
you're
that
conceding. You're still conceding
but
too much.
I said nothing about Corbynista goodies. About goodies from on high. No, I'm saying paint a vision of what we Britain are going to do in the future. What is our nation going to look like? Are we going to be rich? Are we going to be poor but equal? What is our vision going to be? That kind of thing, not the goodies that you're going to get once we leave the European Union. That's what I refer to when I say the poetry, right? What is the poetry of Brexit? Not like, oh, well, now we don't have the European Union because Boris Johnson went and signed a document and now we're free, right? Like, that's what I'm getting at.
The program that we offer is the vision for constituting a new British nation, right? One that is formed from Britain, not incorporating Northern Ireland, the 6 counties of Northern Ireland into the Union. So we think that that Northern Ireland is a weakness, in fact, in British sovereignty, for reasons that are laid out in detail in the book, but have been vindicated through the process of Brexit. As we said, the way in which Boris Johnson secured the withdrawal agreement was by fragmenting the sovereignty of the UK. Effectively, he has to cede sovereignty over Northern Ireland to the European Union, drawing the trade border in the Irish Sea, effectively, between Britain and Ireland. And so the Irish, the prospect of Irish reunification, which is more closer now than it has been in a generation, if not perhaps for 100 years. That is a real kind of possibility of a democratic gain for Brexit, and a gain for self-determination, both in Britain and in Ireland. All of our proposals are linked towards greater voice, though, right? Which is to say, representation, and constituting a new coherent citizen body that is capable of exercising rule over itself and also carving out a new space for itself in the world. And so you mentioned, for instance, one of the programs. So part of the program that we offer is internal renewal through political reconstitution, a unicameral parliament based on abolishing the House of Lords with expanded representation, one parliamentarian for every 50,000 electors. At the moment, it's something like one parliamentarian for every 70,000 electors. So if this proposal of ours was instituted, you would have a radically expanded House of Commons, as well as, like you say, kind of restructuring the party system through proportional representation, through ending corporate funding, through forcing parties to seek individual funding, with caps on what any individual could support. And these, just to be clear, I mean, these proposals are very explicitly designed to create the greatest possible input from the British people into shaping a new political state on the one hand, but also carving out international leadership. And one of the kind of key roles for that would be to consolidate on the Brexit process by Brexiting from NATO, which, as I imagine most of our listeners will agree, given NATO's record in places like Libya, Afghanistan, and the former Yugoslavia, is the enemy of national sovereignty. Perhaps the single organization that is most hostile to the idea of national sovereignty in world politics today. And so, consistent with the process of Brexit, with the politics of Brexit, we propose leaving NATO. And in that way, Britain would carve out a new politics for itself in the international realm, a politics of armed neutrality rather than the geopolitical polarization that we're seeing between Russia and the US playing out in Europe at the moment, and also repudiate the legacy of humanitarian wars and liberal imperialism that have been so central to NATO's mission since the 1990s. Right, so this would offer a new model of international cooperation infused with the democratic rejuvenation, both of Brexit and of the proposals that we offer in the book.
I mean, it sounds like a bit of a cop-out, but in some ways the proposals are just to increase democracy and then to have the faith that if you were to do that, then the kind of almost the political economy will follow. I think this is like a very old, like if you want to kind of say like what's the history of the left, almost the first moment around the French Revolution was this kind of emergence of popular sovereignty, and then it was only in the 19th century that almost gets applied to economics. So we're kind of like going back quite a long way to say, well, what are the things that we could do to have a more democratic country, and then the actual kind of gains of that. Not to go back too much of that earlier Lexit point, but it's not instrumental. These gains justify the transition to democracy. The transition to democracy is justified in and of itself, and we believe, I guess, essentially in the British people, that the more democracy you have, the better society you will end up having, and that's kind of, I think that's to summarize all the specific proposals. What's the animating force behind them? More democracy equals better, therefore, a more prosperous, materially rich, kind of integrated and kind of flourishing society. So yeah, I mean, that might sound a little bit basic perhaps, but I think that's, identifying democracy and sovereignty at the core of the contradictions that led to Brexit. We tried to follow that through into what the proposals were, and those will change as the context changes in the next few years, I'm sure.
So one last question, just before we finish off and say goodbye. I think, there's a proviso here, which is that I suspect Brexit happened in the UK, and it was even led to the stage of actually hosting a referendum, in part because there's a reservoir of feeling of kind of cultural difference from Europe being an island. The relatively recent history of empire, which at least amongst kind of more right-wing sectors of society, a feeling that no, we can kind of go it alone and that we're less enmeshed with other European countries. For this reason, it was probably got to that stage maybe more than it would be likely to get to that stage in other European countries. You may disagree. I'm not looking for discussion on that. What I am saying that is that even should it arise that there is a referendum on European membership in another EU member state, what lesson would you give if you had to give one lesson to people also seeking to leave the EU, maybe reflecting on something that you regret doing or regret not doing over the Brexit process?
I think the question, I suppose it's possible to package an answer which addresses both of your points. The internal divisions within member states of the European Union are the basis of the existence of the European Union itself. And so the process of withdrawing from the European Union is itself a process of reconstituting national sovereignty. there is no nation state to go back to. And this was very much, I mean, we suspected this. This was our theoretical expectation.
It's one of the most
but
interesting
this
points in
was,
the book, I have to say, just to highlight to listeners.
is vindicated by the Brexit process. I mean, I think there were plenty. I mean, maybe this is unfair, but I think it's. I think I can say it with confidence. There were plenty of people, including Brexit voters, who imagined that kind of a British nation state or a vibrant United Kingdom would simply snap into place once the integument of European Union membership was cast off, as if it was simply kind of an uncomfortable pair of clothes. But in fact, the whole process, its bitterness and its intensity, the political and social divisions that it revealed and the polarization that it unleashed, indicated that the European Union was not something external to the British state and society, but something that was very much a structural feature. It was embedded in British society itself. It was an outgrowth of dynamics that were entirely internal to Britain itself. And so the process of withdrawing from the European Union, is a process effectively of nation building. And so that would be the task. And I think this is not just for existing member states of the European Union, but I think for any country that would be looking to significantly alter its relationship with liberal globalism or neoliberal globalism over the last 30 years. That it's essentially what confronts states around the world is essentially a process of nation building, which is to say a process of recreating the possibility of coherent, meaningful politics around sovereign states. And so this goes to why Britain. I mean, the question of why Britain was able to do it, I think most of the reasons are fairly contingent. I don't think it was the memory of empire, I think, factors perhaps only in unexpected and odd ways. It was a slander cast by many left-wingers on Brexit voters that they were nostalgic for empire. But, a solid 1/3 of Britain's ethnic minorities voted for Brexit. And the reason for that, probably, and this is the argument made by Hans Kudnani, is that a lot of it was Asian support for returning to a Britain that was more linked to the former empire with the Commonwealth, say, because it was Britain turning its back on immigrants from the Commonwealth in the 1970s and opening itself up to Europe. That was seen as Britain kind of turning its back on the former subjects of the empire, right? So the point is that if there was pro-imperial sentiment in the Brexit vote, it probably manifested itself in some of Britain's ethnic voters voting for Brexit, as much as it might have motivated Tory, old Tory voters who might have been misty-eyed about Britain's status in the world. And in fact, it was, Remainers who were more committed to maintaining Britain's global position. Now, I'm saying all of that.
No, certainly. I meant more, a limited body of Tory Remainers. Tory Leavers, sorry.
What I guess I'm saying is not to think that that British exceptionalism means that these kinds of challenges, political challenges and political opportunities aren't offered to other countries. Because in as much as there was British exceptionalism in Brexit, it manifested itself in all sorts of unexpected ways, right? Unpredictable and unexpected ways. But whatever it is, I think it's nation building, and the alternative to nation building is Brazilianization. And you've said this yourself, Alex, right? And so I think that is really the kind of the political choices that confronts most countries that are capable of any kind of meaningful political self-sufficiency, political independence, in as much as they are at all. If they are to have any kind of self-government at all, whether individual or collective, then what's involved is a process of nation building. And Brexit Britain is further ahead in that path than any other state in the West, if not in the world.
Yeah,
George.
I mean, questions of lessons for others from Brexit. I think it is a good one. I mean, not least because we did establish a lot of links internationally. Talked to a lot of Eurosceptics. I think left Eurosceptics would be the right term, probably across Europe. I mean, but when you kind of pose this question, the first thing that it made me think was to go back right to the first question you asked, like, what would I have done differently if I'd known on the 24th of June 2016 what I know now. I mean, I guess I was quite surprised how clarifying almost instantly, like, the referendum and the response to the referendum was. It was, a culture war, a political war, a kind of battle over democracy. All these things kind of rolled into one pretty much immediately. And I was tried to be quite active in kind of going to I guess political meetings and joining groups of not just the full Brexit, but kind of people who we thought might be aligned in various different ways. And what was more or less immediately revealed was the central place of the Labour Party on the British left. And this is something which I'd obviously accepted theoretically previously, but I was just like, well, actually, this was a really clear lesson that people were prepared to toe a quite, I think, like not very viable at all line on Lexit. Like, we just need to do whatever it is to get Labour into power, and to kind of leave the ideas of popular sovereignty, democracy, respecting the vote, like respecting working class people's ability to make political decisions, like, just leave those at the door. So it was, basically, I guess what I'm saying, like, in a really long-winded way, is that the people who I thought were going to be the kind of allies were not really. So that, I think, is a lesson that that would apply if any other country went through a process of leaving the EU. That essentially the political, it's very stark, right? The political battle lines are drawn in quite a kind of reductive way, but that can be quite illuminating. I think theoretically, what one of the lessons from Brexit probably is that we make this distinction between a nation state and a member state. On it's the Hartfield-Bickerton thesis, as we put it in the book, and there's quite a lot of theory behind this. But anyway, the basic idea is that you leave the EU, you don't go back, or you don't transform the state into suddenly a democratic one. So now we're left with all these post-Brexit, post-nation state, post-member state pathologies. And what is the way to describe these? I think the best concept is this idea of a post-member state. We're not it's not a democratic society, but it is a political context in which the political class have been trained in all the ways, all the kind of ways and means of the member state. But we're not in that situation now. So this is partly what we use in the book to explain what happened with COVID, what happens in the years after leaving the EU. So it's like, I guess it's kind of a sobering lesson in some ways. One, that the political alliances that you might have to make are not the ones you expect. And secondly, you kind of you advocate for something, and even with the explicit argument this is necessary but not sufficient, and then when it ends up happening, you're faced with, oh shit, there's still a lot more to do. But that requires a whole nother set of arguments and alliances and defeats. And that's what is it? Politics is boring to hold in hard wood, or whatever it is, the phrase. But yeah, it certainly requires a lot of that. So yeah, I mean, but it was still
Right.
It was a fun ride, and a great book was written as a consequence.
It's the first successful democratic revolt against neoliberal globalization, and that is its world historic significance. And I think its implications and repercussions are likely to be felt both in British and in European politics for years to come, if not decades to come yet.
Well, hopefully
we're back at the forefront of world history for the first time since 1640. So good for us.
Hopefully someone overtakes Britain and goes even faster and farther, and then we can be talking about that, and as the European Union comes under further strain. Okay, taking control, sovereignty, and democracy after Brexit. Do get a copy. As I said, there's some really interesting points which I hope have come through here. Maybe some which also weren't raised maybe so explicitly. I think, as I said, I think this nation of having to rebuild The Nation is really interesting, stuff that I wasn't actually familiar with, even though I talk to Phil and George all the time. So worth getting a copy, and you can get a copy at places where you buy books. So do that. Okay, listener, thank you for sticking along with this on this thing about Brexit. We probably won't be talking about Brexit anytime soon again, but we would be interested to hear what you thought. Were you convinced by these arguments? And are you doing something to take back control where you are? Let us know. And that's it from us for now. Catch you next week. Bye-bye.